Okay, it is 10 o'clock now. It's on the hour, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And I welcome you to today's commemoration, our tribe's commemoration of Trans Day of Remembrance, which is dear to myself and to all my trans siblings around the world, where we commemorate, where we actually we remember our trans siblings that we've lost due to trans-based violence, mostly in the form of murders, but some other sort of violence. I was meant to be joined this morning by Liberty, who you have in front of me. I will introduce Liberty a little later, and Aisha Mughal, pardon me, from Pakistan. But unfortunately, Aisha has had an emergency that she cannot be on this webinar today. A bit of background, and this is something we were going to talk about a little later in the discussion. So Aisha is from Pakistan. She is a prominent trans activist in Pakistan and is the director of an organization called Wajud. She has personally faced threats to her life and backlash from the Islamist political party that is trying to overturn the Transgender Protection Act of Pakistan. And with that, she has moved to Thailand. She's only been here for about a month or just under a month. And she's had to go back to Pakistan for a family emergency. So our thoughts and prayers are with her. And we just send her all the positivity and pray that she gets through the ordeal safely and she's able to get back to safety. And I see Lauren has raised her hand. Lauren, are you able to speak, or do you only have capability to chat, to type in the chat? Well, I'll put in the question and answer. Okay, is your hand still up? All right, so this will just be a discussion between Liberty and myself around Trans Day of Remembrance, what it means to us, and we will be diving deep into the various forms of violence that we experience as trans people, and what's the driving force and the root cause behind these incidents of violence that we do experience. I will introduce Liberty. Liberty is a colleague, a sister, a friend, a sibling I've known for many years when I was still back in Southern Africa. And Liberty is a dynamic, smart, big personality, although quietly spoken individual. Liberty is the director of Gender Dynamics, which is the largest trans organization, trans-Pacific and trans-led organization on the continent of Africa, and has the trans footprint going back more than, correct me if I'm wrong, 10, 12, 13,
17 years.
17 years, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So they've been around for a long time. I will allow Liberty to give a bit of an introduction of herself, and then we'll dive into the discussion.
So I think, Rikki, thank you for that. That would suffice. I like a short and sweet introduction. It means that you don't have to live up to the biography that we sometimes have to do when it's these long biographies. So thank you for the introduction.
Yeah. So I mean, so the first question, and this is the question I think we need to dig deep in, and I invite the participants to respond as well. And if you feel like putting your question in okay, I see there's a question. Okay, no problem, Lauren. Noted. So if you feel that you want to dive into the conversation, put your hand up, we'll stop and I want this to be a very interactive discussion, as opposed to us talking in a lecture scenario where we are all involved and we are all interacting with each other. And my first question to Liberty, and I think this would go to everybody out there, what does Trans Day of Remembrance mean to you specifically?
So I think for me, it's really a day that works in tandem with Transgender Day of Visibility. And on this particular day, we are reminded of all of the lives lost of our siblings as a result of transphobic violence, and of course, the consequences of stigma and discrimination. It's a day upon which I often reflect on many of my siblings that I've lost. And yesterday, especially, I asked myself, do you post something online? And I decided, no, I'm not going to post something. I'm just going to be with the memories of the big sisters and brothers and siblings that I had that has gone before, some of whose names we know, others whose names we don't know, who have struggled for our liberation and the freedoms that we can enjoy to some extent, and differently so in different contexts that we exist in. I think of Lee Davids, I think of Netta Marcus, I think of Roxy Court, I think of Adrian Galagazzi, and so all of these women, trans women especially, that have been taken away from us far too soon. And so this day is a day where we are reminded of the cost of stigma and the discrimination. We are also reminded, I'm reminded of that resilience has a limit. When we look at the amount of siblings who have taken their lives because of the stigma and the discrimination, and not feeling that life was worth living because of the daily hardships that they've had to live through. And so for me, it's a particularly sad day, but then I also look at how we are able to come together as community and recognize the power that we continue to have, the power of the memories and the legacies that those that have gone before have left behind, and that we can continue building on. This year alone, we have said goodbye to 14 trans and gender diverse persons in South Africa alone. And those are just the people that we know of who have passed on, and they've passed on for different reasons. They passed on because of suicide. 3 young people, still school-going trans children, that committed suicide because of living through unsupportive families and communities and systems, education systems especially, who do not understand what it means to respect and protect the dignity and the rights of these young ones. And then, of course, brutal murders, again, as some of our siblings, particularly trans women who were stabbed to death, one person who was gunned down, and one person who was stoned to death. And so there are these continued occurrences in society, but we need to be mindful that the way in which we experience physical violence on a day-to-day basis is as a consequence of much bigger systemic and structural violence at play. And that is really where we are paying our attention as an organization, to recognize the symptoms of deep entrenched inequalities and to see how do we undo systems and structures who have made it their mission to oppress us. And so this is a very heartbreaking day, Rikki. But of course, we live in a space of hope, and we will continue to move from a space of hope to make positive change happen.
Right, yeah. And it also brings to me, obviously, for all the things that you've said, the siblings we've lost, the people we've known, those bright stars that were snuffed out so early in their lives, it's really hurtful. But it also brings to mind very painful memories for me when I think of what could have been in my own situation, where I had to relocate from my own country due to, as you said, systemic violence, political violence, living in a country, in a situation where you're not acknowledged, you're not given the dignity to exist as you actually are, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association. And those are very important topics that I think I'm hoping that we can bring out in this conversation around how we can link the violence that we're seeing now, or we've been seeing throughout trans history, where people have been targeted and have been singularly pointed out for violence and persecution and even murder and obliteration by virtue of the fact of who they are. And that is something that is really important for us to see. How do we, as advocates and as activists, how do we interrogate the system? How do we disrupt the politics that are in existence for us to be able to do that? And that's something that I don't think between you and I, two little people from Southern Africa, can do on this call, but certainly it's something that I think it's a discussion for us to start having in order for us to be able to do that. And even if you think about what's happening, I mean, Aisha's not here now, right? Because she was in, she was now temporarily living in Thailand, pardon me, having fled Pakistan for these same reasons, for the same reasons you're talking about. She has personally had, I've been speaking to her for a while, and I was hoping that we'd have this conversation today. Pardon me. She's been having, in the last 3 to 4 months, she's had at least 2 attempts on her life. People have come to her home, they physically attacked her, and it brought back so many memories in my own experience where that happened to me back home. And when I think of myself and I think of Aisha and many other people that this has happened to, I'm so thankful that I was able to get out of this situation. I may not be sitting here today and having this discussion with you. And Aisha also may or may not have been where she was. And I just pray that she gets back to safety after having gone back to Pakistan. But it really is important. I mean, let's speak to you spoke a little about the you said 14 trans people were lost in South Africa. Teens were lost to suicide. Some people were brutally murdered. They were stabbed, they were gunned down, they were stoned to death. So can you just dig down deeper into the violence that trans and gender diverse people are facing in South Africa and Southern Africa as a region?
Certainly, and to the point that you made early on, we are small kitties in a big world, but small kitties that can make a big roar when we need to, in order to take up space and to shift the context with allies and with siblings who are committed and driven to making systemic change happen for our communities. Just surviving every day in itself is a battle. And I think I was having a conversation with somebody after going to church yesterday. And I said, just being in that space, knowing that religious transphobia is rife, just sitting there and being visible, being present in itself is so powerful, because it cannot be taken away that you have been in that space. You want to hold community, you want to build society in ways that are known and in ways that cannot be anticipated at this moment. And so living through that violence is deeply traumatizing, but I take my hat off every day for every trans and gender diverse persons who see the revolutionary power that carries, just to be able to be visible and present in a particular space. And of course, there are many of us that can't be as visible as we would want to be, because of how deeply hostile and punitive the context is. And so I think I just wanted to make that additional contribution. Coming to the issue around the role that political violence and of course political transphobia and religious transphobia plays in shaping social context cannot be underestimated and discounted. We see that on a day-to-day basis, where there is where political leaders are scapegoating LGBTQI+ communities as being the cause of unprosperous countries and underdevelopment, then we see how little our lives matter within particular contexts, and I would want to say all contexts. We see how religious leaders come out and they want to gain momentum and popularity within cases in order to gain a particular base in order to support the leadership of claims that they seek to make. And that's deeply problematic. And I think that a lot of the work that we try to do, whether directly or in solidarity, is to push back against that. We have examples of what happened within the Zambian context and how again, LGBTQI plus people and groups and organizations, and especially trans and gender diverse groups and organizations, were scapegoated, and people were actively under attack, actively fearing and fleeing for their lives within the country. And so again, it brings us back to the point around the cost of political and religious transphobia. But aside from that, these leaders also end up influencing policy discussions, law reform discussions, whether that is to ensure that we remain invisibilized and excluded, or whether it is to roll back rights to ensure that the gains we've made is rolled back at our expense. And so I think that when I looked at what transpired in South Africa this past week, and South Africa has always heralded the world over as having this progressive constitution that enshrines the right not to be discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation and gender. And there's subordinate laws, such as the Act 49, the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003, that's a legal mechanism through which transgender and intersex persons are able to change their gender markers. A country with same-sex marriage rights, where in such a country, you could still see the conservative right-wing backlash emerging quite strongly. We had an incident where two organizations, one Family Policy Institute and the other one Freedom of Religion South Africa, put out a statement to basically challenge the recently passed SOGI-esque sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics guidelines that was passed by the Department of Basic Education to make education spaces safer for LGBTQI young children. And so they pushed back and indicated that the right to religion should supersede the right to dignity and equality and freedom for LGBTQI plus people and children. That LGBTIQ plus people, activists and policymakers are trying to shove down society's throat a particular agenda that seeks to invisibilize and erase cis-normativity and heteronormativity. And so we can already see this backlash building, and that coupled with linkages with conservative right-wing parties such as the African Christian Democratic Movement and the Freedom Front Plus is exceptionally dangerous. We've recognized the linkages that they have with right-wing groups in America that we also see are clamping down on trans rights, are clamping down on LGBTQI people's rights and women's rights broadly, and depriving us of our bodily autonomy and right to gender self-determination. And so if that can happen in our context as a country with its constitutional and legal protections, then of course the context is much more dire in other contexts across the African continent if we just use South Africa as a barometer. So the time is now where we definitely should be uniting more fiercely than ever before to make sure that there are no further rollbacks of rights in countries that are pushing for rights realizations, and that there are no rollbacks in countries where rights realizations have already been achieved to some degree.
Great job. And speaking to the anti-gender movement, the bigger opponents that we have, the religious fundamentalists, the anti-gender movement, and they're all working in tandem to deprive everyone of their human rights, anyone that they see to be a threat to the cisgender heteronormative lifestyle that they want us all to have. But I mean, living in the United States, it has been it's been a rude awakening for me to see the anti-trans to see the backlash against trans rights in America. It really has been eye-opening to see how, like you say, in South Africa has like the best constitution in the world, but there are all these issues. And what the United States is being heralded as the first nation of the world, and having being a democratic society, and all these positive sentiments about the United States. It really is not a walk in the park in the United States. And it's even sadder to see how being the first nation of the world, and it's always been taken to be the country to look up to and to emulate, and for them to be advancing this discourse, this very anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, far-right politics, is sending such a dangerous message to countries like we have in Africa that do not uphold human rights or civil rights for everybody. Speaking more so of the minority groups of the LGBTIQ people and women. It really is very dangerous in that it is just reinforcing what they've always wanted to do all along. So, and that is something I think we need to interrogate and to question as activists and with our allies. What do we do to be able to get past this? To beat this monster that just seems to be so big and so intimidating, and how can we preserve the lives of those that we set out to represent? It really is. It's a big ask for all of us. So my next question is, we often look at physical forms of violence experienced by trans and gender diverse persons, but we overlook that these outcomes of systemic and structural we overlook that these are outcomes of systemic and structural inequality. What work do you do in your context to challenge and eliminate the systemic and structural forms of transphobic violence?
Thanks, Rikki. So a lot of our work revolves around policy advocacy, and we recognize that if we can influence where the law can go in being able to provide dignity, equality, and freedom, albeit just on paper, for our communities, for us, it is at least one step in the right direction, because at least it offers the basis for non-discrimination. It offers the basis for affirmative protections. In South Africa, unlike some of the our neighboring countries, in particular within Southern Africa, we've got a piece of legislation, the Act 49 that I spoke of earlier on. We also are able to get access to gender-affirming healthcare from the state sector, from the public healthcare sector. Although waiting lists for access to hormonal care can be as long as 2 years, and we can access to gender-affirming surgeries can be as long as 25 years, and some surgeons are also indicating that it can now be as long as 40 years to wait for your gender-affirming surgeries. And so the way in which citizenship in the country, and I'm using that very loosely and very broadly, has been conceptualized for people in the country who identify as trans and gender diverse persons, is that it relegates us to second-class citizens. And that includes migrants that are in the country at any given point in time, further being marginalized from the ambit of protection in the law if you are trans and gender diverse identifying. And so a lot of our work really is to look at law reform on the basis of gender self-determination to make sure that a new iteration of legal gender recognition law in the country recognizes gender beyond the binary, that the Act is demedicalized to ensure that no trans person should have to prove through medical evidence that we are who we say we are. It should be a quick and simple administrative process for us to be able to change our forenames and to be able to change our gender markers. It should not be rocket science. And this is, we put out the 20 recommendations we've made in a position paper we published, and that was endorsed by the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Justice. But the process in getting change realized is painfully slow. And so we are at this point in time even contemplating litigating against the department, because justice delayed, in essence, is justice denied. And so we are not going to be waiting into perpetuity. We want it as soon as we can have it. And if the courts need to pronounce, then so be it. The second concern is really around decentralizing access to gender-affirming hormonal care, to stop it from only being a tertiary academic healthcare competency, to be able to decentralize that to primary health level in order to form part of universal healthcare coverage packages for our community members. So anyone in a remote village or town, in a rural space or in a peri-urban space, should be able to access that right as a basic right, a healthcare right for trans and gender diverse persons. So those are our two advocacy concerns at the moment that we are hoping to work on and get that pushed through. The other component is really around community empowerment. And I think what the lack of data, so we noted that TGEU, Transgender Europe, released the Trans Murder Monitoring Report this year, and there were no statistics for Africa. And so that was equally a concern for us, as I'm quite sure it is for TGEU, because it's basically silent in that regard. And what we've recognized is through our REACT program, which is a human community-based monitoring human rights documentation program, through which we are able to systematically document human rights violations experienced by our community members. And so what we've realized is we need to strengthen this particular program. So now we are scaling it up to have national reach in order to ensure that when it comes to being able to put out a global report, we have the actual data available to be able to be integrated in that report. Because as said earlier on, it's not that we didn't have cases in South Africa. We had 14 cases of transgender persons passing away for different reasons. Some 50% of which is ascribed to hate crimes based on the 14 examples that I gave. So hopefully by the next cycle, we are able to provide greater input through this particular program and also scale it at a regional level to make sure that at the regional level, Southern Africa, we are able to provide that level of support to global reporting and really depicting the true nature and extent of transphobic stigma, discrimination, and violence. And I think the Southern Africa Trans Forum, I'm an ex officio member on behalf of GDX. I see the chair of the SATF is also on the call. The Southern Africa Trans Forum could be a great vehicle through which we can prioritize such a regional evidence-generating mechanism to put data and information out there. And I think lastly, if I can just conclude on the point, we need to be, as an organization, we are trying to push more for disaggregated data by the state. A lot of some African countries is not in the position to do that because of the regressive legal political stance on LGBTQI+ rights. And so it's very difficult for our counterparts to get entry point in order to make claims such as disaggregated data for our community members. But for us, it is important because when there's a hate crime, when there is a case of femicide, when there's gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, cases of domestic violence, we need to understand how this impacts our community. So when a trans or gender diverse person, and broadly speaking LGBTQI+ person, goes to a police station to report a case, an investigative officer and somebody taking the initial report should be able to identify the case as it is, that it is a member of our community that is reporting the case. Hence, the case needs to be investigated in particular ways to gather evidence so that it can stick as a hate crime, so that it can stick as a transgender femicide case. Because if our state departments can't do that, ultimately our communities will remain invisible.
Thanks, Dr. So there again, we go back to policies, we go back to laws, we go back to the lack of protection of the trans and LGBTQ people in general. So I mean, what would it take for us to reach that point? You know, you're living in South Africa, you're in a country that has such a progressive constitution, but yet we're still facing these hurdles. And then what does that speak to for the rest of Africa, for the rest of countries that do not recognize the queer community? What does that say for everybody? And I think it also begs the question within ourselves when it comes to like forms of identity. As you say, 14 trans people alone died by suicide. Some were stoned to death, some were stabbed. And I think even within our own community, we need to come to the realization of our identity, right? A lot of trans people still do not realize or haven't come to the self-realization that they are trans, and they still identify as either being gay or queer or lesbian. And then I think with that said, when it comes to capturing the data, even at the level of the policy level of the policing, like, as you say, when people are reported, when these homicides are reported, they are incorrectly documented as not being transgender or not being trans diverse. So that's something that we need to work around. And it's then again speaks to a form of violence systemically, because then we are not awarded the dignity of identifying as who we are. And the repercussions are, number one, losing your life, and number two, being dying an undignified death. And even in the capturing and the honoring of your life, that is not done in the true essence in which it should be done, which is really, really sad. So it's amazing how we can see it filter through from the top right through to the final act of violence. So the next question was, so GDX is leading an exciting project in Southern Africa, and I was very, very happy to be part of the meetings a couple of weeks ago, where it's called Tsirilitsa, which focuses on countering violence against trans and gender-based persons. Can you tell me more about the project? And let's tie it into the whole violence aspect.
Yeah. So when we settled on the name, there were many names using indigenous languages that we tried to work with, and Tsirilitsa was one of the words that ran through to community members. And so one of the participants explained that from their perspective, in essence, it means to be safe. So to be safe. And so the research project then, of course, spans 8 countries in Southern Africa: South Africa, Lesotho, Eswatini, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Malawi, and Zambia. And it spans 15 partnerships plus gender dynamics, and through which we are trying to bridge the data gap that there is, whereby we know that a lot of the data and information that is captured and gathered from our about our community members, not even by us, it's about us, is very much framed through a biomedical HIV type of understanding. And so we challenge that to say that we are much more than just that. We are all of ourselves at all of the times in which we embody ourselves. And so when we are looking at how violence impacts our lives, then let's have a broad conversation around what that means from a personal level to a systemic and structural level. At the same time, the project is also an opportunity for us to dream about beautiful futures for ourselves and not just get stuck in the prism of violence discourse, but to unlock what could we become within society if we had to embody all of our liberties, no pun intended, at any given point in time. And so this particular project is then playing itself out over the next year. We are hoping to reach about between 800 and 1,000 trans and gender diverse persons in the region. And I think the most exciting part of the project is that we are doing it by ourselves, for ourselves. So I am one of the co-principal investigators of the study. And then the partners that are all involved are all trans-specific and trans-inclusive organizations from across the region. Everybody working on the project is an ally, a supporter, or community member in one way or another, but the baseline is the outright majority of people working on this project. I would probably put a percentage on it, 60 to 70% of us are trans and gender diverse identifying. And through this project, we are, of course, not only invested in generating evidence, understanding, and information to advance evidence-based advocacy, whether at a national, regional, or international level. It is very much about being able to transfer research skills and capacities. So what does it mean when we are done with this project for an in-country partner that is community-based to be able to have research capabilities based on how this project has been set up to leave those skill sets behind so that our partners can drive autonomous, independent research projects that will benefit them and be aligned to their in-country realities and needs. And so I think for us, it's an exciting time. We will probably see multiple reports coming out of this particular study, and hopefully, not hopefully, it is believed that it will inform the advocacy agenda and advocacy cases we are able to make to further advance our rights.
Great, yeah. And personally speaking, I'm on the fringes of this project, being one of the partners. So it really is, it's really exciting. And I was interested to see how, because initially this project was called gender-based violence against trans and gender diverse people of Southern Africa. So that's the main thrust, right, of the research will dig deep into the violence that we face as trans people of Southern Africa. But then also looking at how do we counter that by using that information to be able to advocate for better lives. I mean, practically what that looks like. So, you know, I think what I'm really excited to see coming out of this project is are the advocacy papers that will come up for the countries, which will be used by the organizations, by the advocates and the activists in those countries to advance their own agenda, be it for legal gender recognition, be it for gender affirming healthcare, or for just basic civil rights and civil liberties, and for their own freedom of expression, freedom of association, and just for their human dignity. So it really is exciting. When did you expect for this project to be completed?
So we are hoping that the project will be completed by November next year, when we can start launching the reports. All of the reports should be launched by then based on the current trajectory. Ethics remains a challenge, but we are jumping over those hurdles as they are coming up. And just perhaps to the point that you are the link that you made earlier on, Rikki, around the project being framed around gender-based violence and femicide is that transphobia, by its very nature, is a form of gender-based violence. The exclusion, the erasure, the invisibilization we experience as gendered beings that embody gender in particular ways, that's a form of gender-based violence. And so even when we are looking at framing it as such, we know that the dominant assumptions, particularly within African context, when we're speaking about gender-based issues or gender equality, gender-based violence, what we are actually saying is the empowerment and advancement of the interests and rights of cisgender women and girls, to the exclusion of trans and gender diverse persons. And so we are troubling that, to say that gender-based violence isn't just about cisgender women and girls' rights and needs. That's a big component of the work, definitely, to be able to ensure that we can achieve gender equality, gender equity for cisgender women and girls. But there's a big community that's being left out if we are not going to frame it in context of gender-based violence and gender equality, and that is our community as transgender women, transgender men, gender non-conforming people. And the reason why I say transgender men is because of the how transgender men's interests and rights are being undermined by cis-normativity at play and patriarchy in a different form at play. And so what does it mean for us to use this particular framing of the project and nuance gender equity discourse to the inclusion of everyone? That's important. And I think secondly, the gift of decoloniality is important for us. So how do we start articulating ourselves? Again, going back to the point around the influence that the global north and particularly Western discourse has, sometimes in a very negative way, through conservative right-wing far-right groups projecting influence on the continent. What does it mean for us to be able to unlock decolonial solutions for our challenges and be able to go back to pre-colonial times, unearth indigenous knowledges, in knowledges that Zetu Matebeni, Baso Redi, and academic Sylvia Tamale speaks about, an Africa in which gender and sexual diverse persons lived in harmony with cis heteronormative community members. It was never condoned, it was never condemned, it was accepted as an ordinary part of society. And so for us to be able to speak about a continent that is free from violence, for everyone, including trans and gender diverse persons, we need to ask ourselves, what does our pre-colonial scripts look like, and start taking from that as opposed to looking elsewhere for guidance around where we should be going as a continent.
Excellent. I mean, and speaking to the current structures of government in Africa, and I'd say around the world, basically. If you look at the ministries of gender, like the Minister of Gender, and I'm speaking specifically to that part of the world, to Southern Africa, the Ministry of Gender really looks at women and girls, right? So what happens to gender in its entirety? What happens to gender diverse people? What happens to transgender people? They are not represented anywhere. So if anything, I mean, and another advocacy point which we can use here is, if we advocate for those ministries of gender to be like gender inclusion and diversity, or some new word to encompass everybody. I mean, if gender is even a male gender, so what happens to the males, the transgender, and the gender diverse people if they are excluded by not being women and girls? So that's another point you need to think about. So we're about to wrap up, and I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't see any comments, and I really would appreciate that. But we're going into the last question. And my question is now, what can be done to end violence against trans and gender diverse persons? And what key priorities should we be focusing on?
So I think that it's important for there to be increased resourcing of civil society, organizations and movements to make sure that we are able to safeguard the civic space that has been won already and be able to expand on that. And particularly in context of the rise of the anti-gender ideology movement, anti-rights movement globally. So that's a key priority. I think that for us, because it's sometimes very difficult for us to have conversations with our states on the continent, particularly when we want to do it on our terms and with regards to our issues, and not necessarily the state's agenda and their issues. The international human rights system is often very, very important to us to be able to leverage the opportunities that comes with it. So increased work around that, I think, and increased resourcing for that particular work is crucial. I mean, one example in context of Zimbabwe, where Treat is also on the call, ICOS, Gender Dynamics, and other partners, and I think Transmart as well, developed the shadow report for the United Nations Periodic Review System, Universal Periodic Review System. And through that process, we're able to make recommendations that, of course, through state pressures by other peer states in the space, two of the recommendations were adopted by the Zimbabwean government. The one around banning intersex genital mutilation, and the second one around ending violence against all women and girls, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity, which was very groundbreaking in and of itself for that to have been the case. And so, of course, what's committed to on paper, what plays itself out in the context are two different things. But I think that the power of the international human rights system cannot be discounted, and we need to leverage that more in order to make inroads. We need to be able to push for greater law reform, to be able to make sure that the law reflects what dignity and equality and freedom means for us, from the basis of gender self-determination and bodily autonomy. And of course, for different countries, it looks differently. For us, there's a possibility for it happening, and perhaps that being precedent setting for the region itself. And then, of course, being able to go back to the conversation, the point earlier on around human rights documentation. We need to invest a lot more resources in programs such as REACT to systematically document human rights violations and being able to use that as evidence for evidence-based advocacy. And then, of course, drive our own research agenda using that as a baseline from which to depart.
Thank you, Rikki. Yeah, it's so important that we have to make those linkages. It really is, it's a huge battle we have in front of us. It's been going on for many years now, and I'm not sure in our lifetimes if we'll ever see the justice that we are setting out to, the rights that we are setting, the wrongs that we are setting out to put right. But we have made headway, and we have to continue. I see there's a comment in the question and answer from Sybil Kiskin. Thank you so much for the presentation. Yes, it really is sad. So there was a hate crime in Colorado Springs yesterday, where 5 people were gunned down and were killed. And I see that one of these people was a trans masculine person whose parents said he finished his physical transition in June. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise, and for all the work that Outright does across the world. It really is sad. And, you know, when we speak of this, it's happened on Trans Day of Remembrance, that this person, that we lost a trans sibling. It really is so sad. And when you think of the intolerance that society has for anyone that they see to be different, it's mind-blowing. I mean, I cannot see, or I cannot even fathom what threats the gunman or the person who shot these people, who killed these people, thought that these people posed to him and the rest of society. It really is sad. And I think it's time for us all to reflect now on our roles in society and the importance of it, and how fickle our lives can be. And, you never know from one day to the next when you can be breathing and then gunned down or tragically stabbed or stoned to death, as Liberty mentioned earlier on. So how do we go about mitigating those circumstances? And that's, it's platforms like this, it's conversations like the one that we've just had now, as to what do we do as a community to be able to safeguard our own lives and those of our loved ones. And it's important for us also to realize that the violence that we experience as human beings, as trans individuals, is it's all stems from the root cause is all systemic. It's from society. So society and communities are led and they're ruled by the system, by the policies, by the laws in place. And if those laws are not protective of the trans community, then we'll continue to experience these senseless killings and these senseless violence that we experience. Those laws are also laws in general should be put in place to protect the citizens of any community, of any country. And if the country and if the government and if the systems in play do not protect that individual, that is a form of violence in itself, because they're leaving the person open to discrimination, to beatings, to killings, to being gunned down. So it really is harrowing. Yeah.
It's interesting, Rikki, and our hearts from in Southern Africa, in South Africa, goes out to the loved ones of people who were shot down in Colorado. It's every single time we hear of a shooting on the news, we recognize how deeply entrenched inequality still remains, even within the US. And so we feel a great deep sense of solidarity as you struggle for your own freedom from violence in the context. I think what those moments often bring to the fore is also the politic of intersectionality and how certain bodies matter more, seemingly from the perspective of some than other bodies. And so what does it mean when we are looking at transphobic violence, but just violence in general, when somebody is being killed because of your race, somebody is being killed because of your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your class positioning, because those who believe themselves to be in a superior class than you, in inverted commas, believe that your life means nothing in the greater scheme of things. And so in many instances, we can look at it in a siloed way, but generally it's of course a culmination of so many characteristic traits that we embody that makes us prone to violence and being prone to be more marginalized than others and more exposed to violence than others. I often think about, and probably when we do a deeper analysis of those who have passed on this year in our own context, that it is a transgender woman of color that's coming from a rural peri-urban background, that hasn't had optimal opportunity to finish education, that hasn't been formally employed because of that systemic violence of exclusion from education, that has engaged in sex work, that is living with HIV, with tuberculosis lurking in the background. All of that combined, making that life seemingly less valuable than other lives in society. It highlights how deeply sick we are as a society. It highlights how deeply we need to rethink what we see as transformation and change, so that we can start pivoting our understanding that people who are currently more disenfranchised than others need more support, equitable support, to be able to live dignified, high quality lives the way others are able to. So I think that is my wish, or I'm sending you solidarity, I'm sending you love and light from our end, and that is shared from many people within our context.
Thank you, Rikki. That was so powerful. Yes, and just to repeat, what you've said, we have to be humane. Everybody needs to recognize the next person as a fellow human being and give them the dignity and the respect and afford them the rights which are theirs by virtue of being born human. And that includes especially our trans siblings. And before we leave, I think we just about at the end of this webinar. Do we have any more questions or any comments?
I just realized while we are waiting for questions or comments, Rikki, that we haven't even begun to speak about reparations as part of restorative justice and how much our governments and our peoples need to engage in the process of restorative justice and reparative justice for trans and gender diverse persons. As part of broader healing justice work, if we want our societies to heal, let us then have a broad conversation about how societies have damaged people, how societies have actively kept people back from reaching their full potential. And so there's a cost to that. So let's have a conversation about that too.
Absolutely. And that's why, this is the beginning of this is one of many conversations that we need to have with our governments, with the systems of power that are oppressing us and keeping us where we are. We need to address the patriarchy that's a spin-off of the system. We need to question the whole dynamic of gender and power and what that means. I mean, what does it mean? Why is it that a white male is seen to be more superior to a trans woman of color, as you earlier alluded to? So these are questions that we need to have, and I think this is the beginning of many conversations that we will be having in the future with the Global Trans Program at Outright. And it's interesting to see how common the issues are across the world. Heading the Global Trans Program, this conversation I'm having with you, I could have with somebody in Asia. I could have with somebody even in Europe. They really are common, and it's something we need to address as a community, as a trans community. And we need to grow from strength to strength, and for us to be able to do that. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you, Liberty, to thank you for all the work that you do. I'm very, very conversant of what you do. I've known you for many years. We follow each other quite avidly, and I'm a firm fan of yours. And I'm so glad that we are partnering, not only with this conversation, but with other work outside of this conversation. And for those who are not aware that Outright is, we are an international human rights organization that works on bettering the lives of LGBTIQ people everywhere in the world. We have a team of over 40 people located in more than 12 countries around the world. So we really are trying to make our mark and trying to make this a better place for all of us. With that said, if we have no other questions or other answers, I see there's some comments in the question and answer box. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's hard to know what one person can do, but I want to do something. I live in Colorado. We learned the table shooting.
Yeah, I think it's the next one, Rikki, Sam, and Mariana.
Okay, I don't see that. Okay, let's see open ones. I can't open. Oh, thank you so much, Sam. Sam would say would like to tackle poverty for many of our siblings and strive for improvement of the agency of our siblings through economic empowerment, because as Liberty said, the disenfranchisement are worst affected, just disenfranchised, are worst affected, though financial security may not keep one entirely safe, but it makes a huge difference on how one can better navigate public space. And that is so true, Sam. So we need to think of how best can we better the lives of our siblings. How can we, even as organizations that advocate for the lives of our trans siblings, how can we best make their lives better? What can we do as organizations to economically empower them? You know, like they say, teach, what's the saying? Teach a person to fish, give a person fish, or teach them to fish, and they feed themselves for lives. That's we need to get back to that scenario where we are a strong force to be reckoned with. And to Mariana, thank you very much for joining. Liberty, do you have any closing comments for us?
I thank you so much for having me today, Rikki. And thank you for everybody that has come out to listen and also share your perspectives. We toe the line together for change. And I look forward to continuing some of these conversations with you. And to Sam's point, and in a capitalist society, a bit of a controversial ending for me, in a capitalistic society, one's class protects you. And so we need to look at what our battle is and our struggle is, because in a space such as that, there will always be poverty. There will always be a middle class. There will always be elites. And so we need to trouble that, because if we don't trouble that, we will always find that our community members, many of us, will always be locked into the base and therefore denied and deprived of our liberation and our dignity. And so we need to trouble that and rethink how we reconstitute a society whereby resources and opportunities are also equitably dispersed so that everyone can access it, regardless of who you are.
Thank you very much, Liberty. And do we have one last comment? I do not see anything. So thank you very much for joining. Liberty, thank you so much for your time. I know it's well after 5 o'clock. It's your evening time.
6.
Thank you to everyone who joined, and look out for more webinars that will be coming up soon. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Stay bold, stay beautiful, sis. Bye.
And happy holidays to everyone.
Bye.